Morning, September 15, 1916. Amid the shattered battlefield of the Somme, armored machines crawl through smoke and shell craters while British infantry advances cautiously behind them across the devastated ground. Across the front near Flers and Courcelette, several of these strange vehicles grind forward, crushing barbed wire and edging over trenches while rifle and machine gun fire crackles around them. Some tanks succeed in pushing across the blasted terrain, appearing almost unstoppable to soldiers watching them for the first time amid the chaos of battle. Others break down, slide into shell craters, or stall before reaching the German line, leaving infantry exposed once again to defensive fire from entrenched machine gun positions. In several sectors German defenses begin to weaken under artillery and infantry pressure, yet in others the attack stalls as surviving strongpoints continue firing across no man's land. Through drifting smoke, these armored shapes emerge across the battlefield, slow and awkward yet unlike anything previously seen in the war. How did this experimental machine end up being tested in the middle of one of the most brutal battles of the First World War? To understand that moment on the Somme battlefield, it is necessary to step back and examine how the deadlock of trench warfare pushed armies toward a radical new solution. By 1915 the Western Front had hardened into an immense defensive system stretching across northern France and Belgium, dominated by trenches, barbed wire, and heavily fortified positions. Machine guns and overlapping fields of fire turned frontal assaults into deadly ordeals, making the narrow strip between opposing lines, known as no man's land, extremely difficult to cross. Repeated offensives often produced enormous casualties while capturing only small sections of ground, leaving commanders searching for methods capable of breaking the defensive stalemate. As the war continued, it became increasingly clear that traditional infantry assaults alone were unlikely to overcome entrenched machine gun positions protecting the trench networks. Within this environment of strategic frustration, engineers and military planners began exploring the concept of a new armored vehicle capable of crossing the battlefield under fire. In February 1915 the idea emerged of a machine designed specifically to counter entrenched defenses and neutralize the destructive power of machine guns. The concept was simple but ambitious: a heavily armored vehicle that could move across cratered ground, crush barbed wire, cross trenches, and attack strongpoints directly. If such a machine could survive enemy fire long enough to reach defensive positions, it might open a path through which infantry could advance with reduced losses. Development proceeded in secrecy for many months as designers attempted to transform the idea of a landship into a practical weapon. By September 1916 the British Army finally received its first operational armored vehicles, known as the Mark I tanks. These machines were built with armored hulls designed to resist small arms fire, while their wide tracks allowed them to move across rough terrain and shell-torn ground. Two different variants were produced for battlefield use, each adapted for a specific role within the assault. The male version carried cannons and machine guns intended to destroy enemy strongpoints, while the female version relied primarily on machine guns for close defensive fire. Together these vehicles were expected to cross no man's land, crush barbed wire barriers, and neutralize defensive positions before infantry reached the trenches. Despite the promise of the new machine, the tanks remained experimental and untested in real combat conditions. Their engines were relatively unreliable, and the vehicles could still become stuck in shell holes or roll awkwardly over uneven terrain. Even so, British commanders believed the tanks might offer a technological answer to the brutal stalemate dominating the Western Front. Meanwhile, the war continued without pause. On July 1, 1916, Allied forces launched a massive offensive along the Somme River in northern France. The opening day alone produced more than 57,000 British casualties, making it the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Despite the scale of the assault, the offensive quickly bogged down into a prolonged struggle across shattered terrain filled with trenches and shell craters. Throughout the summer Allied forces launched repeated attacks, supported by artillery bombardments that churned the landscape into a devastated wasteland. Yet progress remained painfully slow as German defenses absorbed the assaults and continued to inflict heavy losses on attacking infantry. By September the Somme had become one of the most brutal battlefields of the war, marked by attrition rather than decisive breakthroughs. Within this environment British commander Douglas Haig decided the new tanks should be used during a later phase of the Somme offensive. Some officers argued the tanks should be held back until larger numbers were available, but Haig ordered that the machines already produced should enter combat. The upcoming attack on the German defenses near Flers and Courcelette would become the first opportunity to test them in battle. The plan called for tanks to advance ahead of infantry formations in small groups, destroying machine gun nests and creating gaps in the defensive line. Behind them, infantry would move forward while artillery supported the assault across across the devastated terrain of the Somme battlefield. The new weapon had never been tested under real battlefield conditions, yet it was about to be deployed in one of the largest battles of the war. For the attack planned on September 15, 1916, British commanders assigned 49 Mark I tanks to participate in the offensive. However, the difficulties of operating such new machines quickly became apparent even before the battle began. Several tanks broke down during movement toward the front line, while others became trapped in shell holes or lost on the devastated battlefield. As a result, only 32 tanks actually reached the starting positions before the attack commenced. From that reduced number, even fewer vehicles would manage to enter combat once the offensive began. Mechanical problems and the difficulty of navigating the shattered terrain steadily reduced the armored force intended to spearhead the assault. By the time the attack approached its starting moment, the original plan was already weakening under technical limitations. Then, early in the morning of September 15, 1916, the long-prepared offensive finally began across the Somme front. Infantry units advanced from their trenches while artillery continued firing across German defensive lines. Among them moved the surviving tanks, rolling slowly forward toward their first real combat. The battle was beginning with part of the armored force already lost before reaching the battlefield. As the attack unfolded, the tanks that reached the start line began advancing across no man's land together with the infantry formations behind them. Some vehicles succeeded in crushing barbed wire barriers and crossing trenches that had previously stopped infantry assaults. In several locations, German soldiers were startled by the sudden appearance of these armored machines emerging through smoke and cratered terrain. Their unusual appearance and apparent resistance to rifle and machine gun fire created confusion among defenders encountering them for the first time. In certain sectors, the tanks helped suppress defensive positions, allowing infantry units to move forward into German trenches. However, the limitations of the new machines quickly became clear as the battle progressed. Many tanks broke down during the advance or became trapped in shell craters scattered across the battlefield. Others moved so slowly across the shattered terrain that infantry following them struggled to maintain the pace of the attack. In some areas, tanks failed to reach their assigned objectives, leaving attacking infantry exposed to German machine gun fire once again. The original plan to break through the defensive line along a broad front began to fragment into a series of isolated engagements. Despite these setbacks, a number of tanks continued advancing and supporting the assault in localized sectors of the battlefield. One tank, nicknamed Crème de Menthe, reportedly cleared German defenders from a ruined sugar refinery, allowing Canadian troops to advance toward Courcelette. Elsewhere, tanks helped infantry overcome secondary defensive positions hidden among craters and trenches scattered across the battlefield. These localized successes allowed Allied forces to penetrate parts of the German defensive system and capture several key positions during the day's fighting. By the end of the attack, Allied troops had advanced approximately 2.5 kilometers along a front roughly 3 miles wide. The results were limited, but the battlefield had witnessed something entirely new: armored vehicles fighting alongside infantry during a major offensive. Following the fighting of September 15, 1916, Allied forces succeeded in capturing important positions near the villages of Flers and Courcelette. In several sectors, German defensive lines were penetrated, allowing troops to move beyond the first trench systems. Nevertheless, the advance remained limited, with Allied forces gaining roughly 2.5 kilometers across a narrow front. Despite these modest results, the battle provided the first real demonstration that armored vehicles could cross barbed wire, traverse trenches, and assist infantry assaults against fortified defenses. At the same time, the battle exposed serious weaknesses in the early tank design. Mechanical failures were common, many vehicles struggled to move across heavily cratered terrain, and only a small number completed their mission successfully. The attack also occurred within the wider Somme campaign, one of the most destructive battles of the First World War. When the offensive finally ended in November, approximately 1.2 million soldiers from both sides had been killed, wounded, or captured. Even within that immense cost, the events at Flers, Courcelette marked a turning point in the history of warfare. For the first time, armored vehicles had been used in battle, opening the path toward a new form of mechanized warfare that would evolve dramatically in the decades to come.